No end to the Ukraine crisis in sight, but all sides agree for now to keep talking. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. We will get to the Ukraine crisis in just a few minutes, but first is some breaking news. More emergency aid from China has arrived in Tonga. The tiny South Pacific island nation was devastated by a tsunami triggered by an undersea volcano that erupted January 15th. CGTN's Meng Chengxing is embedded with the Chinese relief team and filed this report from Guangzhou.
China is ready to deliver this fresh batch of aid to the disaster-hit kingdom of Tonga at the government's request. The emergency supplies on board two Yun-20 military cargo aircraft include food, drinking water, water purifiers, tanks, and wireless communication equipment.
This air shipment of humanitarian assistance for Tonga reflects China's determination and will to promote building a community with a shared future for humanity. After receiving the order, we immediately organized specialists to study the flight characteristics of the South Pacific region. We are now fully prepared for this flight.
China's military earlier expressed that it's a difficult mission as the lingering volcanic dust poses potential danger to incoming flights. It says naval ships will set off on January 31st, a day before the Chinese New Year, to deliver another batch of supplies to Tonga. China's foreign ministry says, in light of the current situation, the country will continue to provide every possible assistance for relief efforts and post-disaster reconstruction.
That was some breaking news on Chinese relief supplies now on the ground in Tonga. Of course, Meng Chengxing on that flight. He'll give us updates throughout, so stay with us for more on that story. Now let's get to our main story. Despite attempts to de-escalate tensions along the Ukrainian-Russian border, talks in Paris Wednesday between Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France saw no breakthroughs. Meanwhile, in written documents delivered to Moscow, the United States and NATO made no concessions on demands that NATO never expand further into Eastern Europe. So what happens next? CGTN's Stephanie Fried gives us details.
Ukraine's Foreign Minister Kuleba is saying that looking toward diplomacy, but also at the same time warning Russia that Ukraine will attack if attacked. There has been a lot of double talk that we've seen from leaders all over the world. An attack is imminent from the U.S. president versus Ukraine's president saying, stay calm. People should stay calm and not become overly panicked over the current situation. So this seems to be more of the same. Perhaps diplomacy, perhaps after the alleged grueling talks in Paris and the agreement of a ceasefire between the sides and to continue the talks next week, perhaps that's the diplomacy that the foreign minister is talking about. But this ceasefire between the two sides has been in place since 2014-15. It has been broken repeatedly. It hasn't been adhered to from either side or from the side since that ceasefire was put into place. And so the question remains about the diplomacy, especially when there are harsh words from Foreign Minister Kuleba, who was in Denmark today visiting with the Queen Margrethe of Denmark, who was giving reassurances or assurances that Denmark will stand behind Ukraine. I will say that here on the ground, as far as Ukrainians are viewing the situation, yes, they're hearing about diplomacy, but at the same time, I am hearing more and more people talk about buying ammunition, buying weapons to defend their homes, their families, and their neighborhoods in places like here in Kiev.
That was Stephanie Fried reporting to discuss this and much more. Let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in Washington, D.C. is Eugene Chausovsky. He's a geopolitical analyst and lecturer at the Foreign Service Institute. From Bethesda, Maryland, Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow and director of research and foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Out of Toronto, Canada is Aurel Braun. He is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. And in New York, Andrij Dobrianksy is the chair of United Nations Affairs at the Ukrainian World Congress. I want to welcome all of you to the show. And Andrij, why don't I begin with you? You just heard that story, a lot of mixed messaging going on surrounding the possible threat of a Russian invasion. Ukraine's foreign minister saying the buildup isn't really enough for an attack, but he went on to say this. Let's listen.
What we currently see is a scenario of destabilization of Ukraine. And that scenario is certainly imminent. It's already taking place by spreading panic, by putting pressure on the Ukrainian financial system, by conducting cyber attacks against Ukraine. This is also part of the Russian plan of aggression.
Andrij, what do you make of his comments?
I'm 100% in agreement with the fact that attacks are ongoing. In fact, what we've heard directed to the White House and the State Department is exactly what kind of attacks constitute a breach worthy of immediate sanctions like the White House has promised. We had a meeting between President Biden here in the United States and the Bucharest Nine and other European leaders trying to define exactly what kind of breach would entail immediate sanctions. As we know, Ukraine has had cyber attacks. All of the Baltic countries have had cyber attacks, as well as Poland. So clearly, Putin is trying to feel out exactly how far to the edge he can go. And unless the West responds firmly and concretely with some of these mother of all sanctions, as Congress has promised, Putin will continue to claw and claw and claw and get as much as he can.
Andrij, we heard the president say, don't panic, but what are you hearing from people inside Ukraine?
I agree with the statement of don't panic because we cherish this as an honored tradition during World War II and other places. Keep calm and carry on is a time-honored tradition of leaders. At the same time, you have regular people making plans, finding go bags, having an evacuation plan, spreading their contact information, and even sending their children to relatives further away from the front. However, Ukraine, as you well know, is currently surrounded by Russian forces, whether that's on the northern border, where they are stationed in Belarus, whether on the Black Sea through the naval forces and the ships from the Baltic that have been deployed to the Black Sea. We have the troops that everybody's talking about in the east of Ukraine, as well as those currently on Ukrainian territory, whether in Crimea or Donbass. And lastly, there are Russian troops in Transnistria, which is why in the westernmost part of Ukraine, you have people taking tactical medical courses in case there's a diversionary tactic attack through the west.
All right, we're going to get back to our discussion in just a moment or two, but joining us right now from Tonga on the phone, we just already talked about what's going on there, Meng Chung. He's embedded with the Chinese relief team that's bringing help to the devastated South Pacific island nation. What can you tell us about the latest there on the ground?
Well, the transport aircraft of China's Air Force carrying tons of disaster relief materials has just arrived at Tonga's Broun International Airport. This is the first batch of supplies sent directly from China. The 8 workers, now I can see them unloading the cargo in a contactless way, as the country has been following strict COVID protocols. It's mandatory that all of us coming from outside the country put on this protective gear. There's a handover ceremony being held in the distance. Tongan officials, including the Prime Minister and delegates from Chinese embassy here, are welcoming emergency supplies arrival. The latest batch of goods include food, drinking water, personal protective equipment, tanks, and walkie-talkies. The aircraft left Guangzhou in southern China Thursday with 3 stopovers along the way to fuel up. Chinese military says it will send naval vessels on January 31st, just 1 day ahead of the Chinese New Year, to deliver another batch of aid. Most of them are bulky items like tractors, generators, and water pumps. This is all I've got from the ground. I will keep you updated. The more information becomes available.
All right, but one quick question before we let you go. Obviously, the recovery effort is going to take a long, long time. The South Pacific island devastated by the tsunami. Give us a sense of what you're seeing so far on the ground there. All right, we've lost the connection there. Hopefully we can reestablish it at a later time. Let's get back to our conversation about what's happening in Ukraine. Eugene, let me ask you, Russia says it is not planning any attacks or invasion. We do have troops, though, massing at the border between Ukraine and Russia. In Belarus, there are fighter jets parked there. We're seeing warships in the Black Sea. Some analysts say these are kind of telltale signs. And yet Petro Poroshenko, the former Ukrainian president, was interviewed earlier this week by BBC, and he said basically he sees it this way. He thinks Putin is blackmailing the world. What do you make of what's going on here?
Well, I would say that I think these military buildups, while very serious, don't necessarily point to an imminent invasion by Russia. We've seen with the security proposals that Moscow gave, and now the U.S. has given a pretty clear answer to, that Russia sees this as kind of a grand negotiation process. So you have diplomacy on the one hand and military buildups on the other. Now, it seems pretty clear that Russia will not be getting everything it wants in terms of a block of NATO expansion, and certainly not a reversion of NATO's members back to 1997. But there's a lot that can happen in between in terms of how the U.S. and NATO treat Ukraine, the extent to which it provides security support. So I think this is all part of a back and forth negotiation process, of which military is one component.
Michael, we're talking about military being one component. The U.S. has already readied 8,500 troops for possible NATO deployment. There are weapons being sent to Ukraine. Give us your sense of how the U.S. is handling this, the Biden administration.
Well, first of all, I agree with my colleague who just said that we should not predict any inevitability to a Russian aggression. I actually assess that President Putin wants to create the anxiety that he's achieved throughout much of the world, and in Ukraine and in much of Western Europe and North America, because I think he wants to change the conversation about the future of NATO and the possibility of NATO ever bringing Ukraine and Georgia in. He therefore wants people to be fearful enough that they remember how fearful they were. That's my best guess. Now, President Biden, I think, has correctly said we will not fight over Ukraine. The 8,500 troops that you just mentioned would not go to Ukraine. They would not fight Russians. They would be deployed to existing NATO member states, most likely Poland and the Baltic states, perhaps some other parts of the essentially NATO eastern frontier, but explicitly not Ukraine. And so in that sense, I think President Biden is prudently distinguishing between a country that we care about but don't have a treaty commitment to defend and the rest of NATO, or other countries within NATO. And he would fight to defend NATO. He will not fight, will not authorize the use of U.S. military force to defend Ukraine. I think that's correct. The only place where I would perhaps critique would be, I would like to see a conversation about alternative security structures that could protect Ukraine and Georgia's sovereignty without NATO membership. But Russia is going to have to be serious about that, and Russia is going to have to be a lot less threatening to those countries than it's been. You can't really have that conversation at the height of this crisis. But I would like to see the United States and the rest of NATO engage on that kind of a conversation. I don't think NATO should automatically expand into Ukraine and Georgia someday. And also, that's sort of the carrot. The stick is, I don't believe that we have threatened yet enough sanctions on Russia if they do invade. If they take a big chunk of Ukraine, I believe we have to find a plan to lower Western countries' dependency on Russian oil and gas. We can't cut it off immediately and entirely, but I think we have to send Vladimir Putin a message. You can't take over a big chunk of a sovereign country and expect to do business as usual. So far, we've left him with the impression that we need the oil and gas so badly that we would have to just hold our nose and keep buying it indefinitely. And I think we have to find a middle ground to accelerate a transition away from Russian oil and gas if he aggresses the way he might. Again, I don't predict that kind of invasion, but I think we have to do our utmost to deter it.
And Michael, you and I have talked a lot in years past about Iraq, Afghanistan, and one of the things I heard an analyst say this week, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is that the U.S. moving out of Iraq, moving out of Afghanistan, that it's not just administrations, but also the people who just really have no appetite in seeing their forces elsewhere, and that Putin recognizes this, and that's why he's moving at this point in time.
Yeah, but we wouldn't have defended Ukraine under any previous president in any previous period. There's never really been any ambiguity. A more interesting case, by the way, if you don't mind my saying, is Taiwan, where I think assessing the American readiness to risk major power war, even as China increasingly improves its military and the issue remains unresolved, that's one that I watch. On Ukraine, whatever people might have said, even President George W. Bush, who led NATO in 2008, to promise that someday Ukraine and Georgia would be in NATO. Even President Bush did not provide any American promise to come to their defense in the meantime. So people can try to draw conclusions, and of course, people are going to try to understand the aftermath of Afghanistan in particular as some kind of a indicator of Biden's foreign policy thinking and American public support, but I don't really think there would have been military defense of Ukraine under any president.
Good point. Aurel, let me talk to you about the countries in Europe and their stance. We talked a little bit about the U.S. What are we seeing there?
Well, in the case of Western Europe, we don't see the unity that the American government claims. Germany is not stepping up. In fact, Germany has played a rather negative role. They are in many ways hostage to energy from Russia, and they are therefore limited in what they can do. The United States has to show more leadership. I don't disagree with the other three speakers that it is not necessarily the case that Russia is planning an invasion of Ukraine. The problem is that sometimes there's miscommunication, misperception, and this is how conflicts start. And that is the great danger, that Mr. Putin may start to overplay his hand, that he becomes too ambitious, that he sees weakness and he tries to exploit it. And this has been one of the difficulties. It's not a matter of the United States having to fight and defend Ukraine. It's whether Ukraine is allowed to be seen as a soft target, whether it's provided with defensive armaments, whether there are sanctions that are really biting, that are prepared, whether there's an attempt to keep energy prices low because that damages Russia. Energy prices that are high helps Russia. And right now what we are seeing is a kind of overreach. Mr. Putin is obsessed with the Great Patriotic War. And what he demanded of NATO was a kind of new Yalta, where he said that he wants to have a sphere of influence, an area that he can dominate, ideally control. But of course, this is not the Second World War. The Eastern European members of NATO are not defeated enemy states. Russia is only a remnant of a superpower with a miserable economy that is largely stagnant with a few pockets of excellence. It's a fraction of the American economy. There's a huge demographic bomb that Russia is facing. So Russia is not a superpower. Mr. Putin is not Stalin. And the West will not help itself. It will not help Ukraine. It will not help the people of Russia itself if it indulges Russian superpower fantasies.
Andrij, Ukraine and Russia finished 8 hours of talks in Paris. No real breakthroughs there, although they did agree to a permanent ceasefire in the Donbass. Do you see that as a positive sign? And is that at least a clear indication that talks are continuing, that we may end up at some kind of settlement here?
I believe that the only way that we get out of this situation is to constantly reinforce Ukraine and constantly reinforce the Western alliance. Putin is going to do what he wants. He has demonstrated this for many years. There is no check on him unless the rest of the world gives him a check. So he will keep on operating, and we know that the changes he made to the Constitution of the Federation means that he can be in power till 2036 at the earliest. Who knows if he extends that further? But it's a very keen comment to talk about the possibilities of after effects here, because this doesn't just affect Ukraine. Ukraine is an enormous producer of lots of things for the rest of the world, not least of which is grain. The grain of Ukraine feeds many countries in the Arabian area. We know that after there was a dispute between America and countries in Asia, that many of them turned to Ukraine to supply that grain. In this time of supply chain difficulties, if something were to happen and Putin, because of stumbling into war and starts bombing those areas that supply the grain, we could be talking not just about the 3 to 5 million refugees in Ukraine, but starvation in other parts of the world. Again, some countries of which get over 70% of their grain from Ukraine.
Eugene, Russia's received these written responses from the U.S. and NATO on its demands for security. They're now being reviewed by Putin. The Kremlin, though, is saying there's not much cause for optimism. Is this basically a stalemate? Who needs to make the next move?
Well, at this point, I think that Russia has made clear that its primary demands have not been met, and that's the halt to NATO expansion. But it was positive in the sense that they had the long discussions in the Normandy format. There will be 2 more weeks until the next discussions take place, so I think that's at least gives some breathing room for both sides to reevaluate their position. And here, I think that's really important to take into the perspective not only of the U.S. and Russia over whether there will be some kind of military conflict, but also countries like Germany and France, which are much more hesitant, to see offensive actions take place. So I think when we consider Putin's options, he's under a lot of constraints that the previous speakers have mentioned, whether that's economic, security, or political, that I think will make him hesitate to take that formal military intervention. But there's a lot of hybrid tactics that Putin can take that are short of that and perhaps less costly for Russia.
Michael, the U.S. has been pretty upfront about this crisis in Ukraine. The Biden administration insisting that Moscow is not going to stand in the way of Ukraine's ambitions to join NATO. I mentioned earlier Poroshenko's interview that I listened to. He says 65% of Ukrainians support membership in NATO. But as you know, back in February of 1990, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker said not an inch further to the east as far as NATO expansion, giving assurances to the Soviet Union at that time. At the same time, in 1990, the West German foreign minister also said Russians must have some assurances that if the Polish government left the Warsaw Pact, one day they would not join NATO the next. There is a sense, not just among Putin, but of other people in Russia, that there's been this sort of betrayal, kind of going back on the word of Baker and others. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not persuaded by this. I've reviewed this history myself. I'm not persuaded that we know exactly what Secretary Baker said and under what auspices, but I do think there was a strong implication in the way that the first Bush administration handled the reunification of Germany, that this would be handled very carefully in the future as well. And certainly the countries we're talking about to the east of Germany would be recognized to be especially delicate in terms of whether or not they had a certain association or membership with NATO. In other words, the spirit of what President Bush tried to do, I think, was changed when we brought other countries into NATO, in my judgment, too quickly and without adequate reframing of what NATO was going to mean as an alliance. And I think it was likely, as Mikhail Gorbachev predicted, as George Kennan predicted, as Secretary of Defense Bill Perry predicted at the time, that Russia would have this kind of a reaction. It doesn't mean Russia's reaction is morally justifiable, but it is sort of naturally human at some level. You've just lost a Cold War. Psychologically, you're sort of on your heels. And then the winning alliance sort of, in a way, if you're a proud Russian, is sort of snubbing you in a sense or rubbing it in your face. I think that was always a questionable policy, and especially now that we get over to Ukraine, which, of course, is so historically intertwined with Russia in every way. It doesn't mean Vladimir Putin should get to choose Ukraine's future by any way, shape, or form, but I think we need a new framing, a new construct that would insist to Putin that he's going to have to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, but also would acknowledge that we don't really have any business bringing Ukraine into NATO. That's the way I look at the history myself. Right. Not quite as much of a smoking gun on Baker, but I agree with sort of the spirit of your question.
And there's been there are these documents that are declassified now where these discussions took place. Aurel, to that point, the Russian stance is that this is really not that unlike the Monroe Doctrine during the Cold War era. Kennedy invoked that when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, and no one wants, on their border, perhaps a hostile force. I mean, do they have a point here?
Every country deserves respect. What Russia is demanding is deference, meaning that their interests should have primacy over the rights of all the people in Eastern Europe. And that is an entirely different kind of thing. That is a violation of international law. It is a violation of the dignity of other countries. And yes, Russia is upset about the enlargement of NATO. It's understandable. But that enlargement did not happen in a vacuum. We have to understand that. It's not that NATO went to these states recruiting them. It is that these states pleaded with NATO. They kept, as Janusz Onyszkiewicz, the defense minister of Poland, said, we're going to bang on your door until you let us in. These countries were worried about Russia's behavior. And it turns out they were worried with good reason. So Russia has agency. Russia is not just a victim. And so it has to examine its own policies. What has it been doing? What is it that it's doing right now that is driving these countries to try to go into NATO? And if we think it's only Eastern Europe, we might see also Finland and Sweden that may want to get into NATO. The other thing I wanted to add was that this is not only about NATO. What Vladimir Putin also fears is that in Ukraine, there could be an alternate model developed, an alternate political and economic model to the one that he has for Russia. And he fears that a great deal. He wants to see Ukraine as a failed state. He wants to isolate. He wishes to demoralize Ukraine. This is why there has to be a combination of diplomatic, economic, psychological, as well as military dimensions in all the negotiations that are being done.
All right.
And unfortunately, this has not been done successfully so far.
Eugene, let me ask you about this Time article written by Anatol Levin. He's a senior fellow at the Quincy Institute. He spelled out some steps for a compromise, and one of them is, the first is a treaty of neutrality or moratorium of 10 to 20 years for Ukrainian membership of NATO. That would diffuse the situation. Do you think that's a non-starter, or is that a good place to start?
I think from an official, formal perspective, that's probably a non-starter, because the US and other NATO countries have made clear that they're not going to defer to Russia on whether or not they expand. But having said that, I think from the Ukrainian perspective, it might actually be good or effective to sort of lessen this formal and public desire to join not only NATO, but also the EU. First of all, because it only provokes Russia, as we've seen, but also because Ukraine has a lot to do still in terms of reforms, whether that's political, economic, and even military, in order to become a full-fledged member of these alliances. So I don't think that Russia is going to get these formal statements, certainly not from the US or from Ukraine, that such membership will be dropped. But perhaps Ukraine can do the actual hard work that it has already been doing to a certain extent, but still has a far way to go. And in the meantime, pursue relations with other countries like Turkey and others in the region in order to sort of maximize its political, economic, and security gains, with the hopes that at some point in the future, EU and NATO membership can come.
All right, gentlemen, thanks so much. It's been a great discussion. Really appreciate it. We're going to have to leave it there, though. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching another edition of The Heat.